Thomas Reed stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his hotel suite, watching the sunset paint the Los Angeles skyline in shades of orange and pink. The city sprawled before him like a living entity, millions of stories unfolding beneath the fading light. His reflection stared back at him, a man in his late 50s with kind eyes that had seen much of the world, lines etched around them from both laughter and sorrow. The quiet moment felt stolen. In 3 hours, he would be at the premiere of his latest film, surrounded by cameras, reporters, and fans. Thomas took a deep breath, savoring the silence. These moments of solitude had become precious over the decades of his career. His phone buzzed on the nearby table. Thomas glanced at it, saw his publicist's name, and let it ring. Whatever it was could wait a few more minutes. People often asked what it was like to be famous. Thomas never quite knew how to answer. How could he explain the strange paradox of being recognized everywhere yet feeling deeply unseen? Millions knew his face, quoted lines from his movies, and created stories about his life. Yet few knew the man behind the image, and that's exactly how he preferred it. Thomas had always been private, guarding his personal thoughts and experiences from the public eye. In an industry where many sold pieces of themselves for attention, he had chosen a different path. He let his work speak for itself and kept his philosophies to himself. The phone buzzed again. With a resigned sigh, Thomas picked it up. "I'm getting dressed, Diane," he said before his publicist could speak. "Good, because the car will be there in 45 minutes, Diane replied. "Are you ready for tonight?" Thomas looked at the black suit hanging on the closet door. "As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, this is just promotion for the film. Smile, be charming. Answer questions about your character and deflect anything too personal." "I've been doing this for 30 years, Thomas reminded her gently. "I think I can handle a few reporters." I know. It's just..." Diane paused. "There's been a lot of interest in you personally since that hospital visit last month." "People are curious," Thomas frowned. What should have been a private act, visiting children at a local hospital, had somehow become public when a staff member posted a photo online. He hadn't done it for attention. He'd done it because his mother had taught him that kindness matters, especially when no one is watching. "Just stick to discussing the film," Diane continued. "The studio's counting on you." "Don't worry," Thomas said. "I'll be the professional they expect." After hanging up, Thomas dressed methodically, his mind wandering to the film they were premiering. It was a good story, a man reconnecting with his estranged daughter after tragedy struck. Thomas had taken the role because it felt real, with characters who spoke like actual people, and faced problems that couldn't be solved with clever one-liners or dramatic gestures. His driver texted that he was downstairs. Thomas took one last look in the mirror, straightened his tie, and headed down. The red carpet was exactly as he expected, a carefully orchestrated chaos of flashing cameras, shouted questions, and faces blurring together. Thomas moved through it with practiced ease, stopping where his publicist indicated, smiling when appropriate, and offering thoughtful but brief answers about the film. "Thomas, over here." "Mr. Reed, can you tell us about working with Director Chen?" "Thomas, look this way, please." He was nearly at the end of the gauntlet when a young reporter stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 25, clutching her recorder like a lifeline, determination written across her face. "Mr. Reed," she called, "I'm Laura from Film Quarterly. I have a question about a theme in the movie." Thomas paused, expecting another surface-level question about his preparation for the role or his relationship with his co-stars. "Your character learns that love requires vulnerability," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "After everything you've experienced in life, what has love taught you personally?" Something in her earnest expression made Thomas stop completely. This wasn't the usual red carpet question. Diane, standing nearby, gave a subtle shake of her head, silently reminding him to redirect. Thomas opened his mouth to give his standard deflection, something about how his character's journey resonated with him professionally, but hesitated. For a brief moment, as cameras flashed and people shouted around him, he considered what it would mean to answer honestly. What had love taught him? The faces of people he had loved and lost flashed through his mind. His parents, gone for years now. His older brother, who had passed too young. Friendships that had weathered time and distance. Relationships that had ended but left him wiser. There were lessons there, hard-earned wisdom he had never shared publicly. "Mr. Reed," Laura prompted, eyes hopeful. Thomas smiled gently. "I think that's a conversation for another time," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Tonight is about celebrating the film and the incredible team who made it possible." The reporter looked disappointed but nodded respectfully. Thomas continued inside the theater, but the question lingered in his mind. During the screening, while everyone around him watched the film, Thomas found his thoughts returning to the young reporter's question. What would he have said if he had answered honestly? What did he actually believe about love after 57 years of living? The after-party was held at a rooftop restaurant with views of the city. Thomas moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and making small talk. But part of him remained distant, still turning over that unanswered question. He found a quiet corner and watched the celebration unfold. The young actors were at the center, glowing with the excitement of being part of something successful. Thomas remembered that feeling, the thrill of arrival, of proving yourself. Now, after decades in the industry, he found more satisfaction in the work itself than in its reception. "Not in the mood for champagne?" a voice asked. Thomas turned to find Robert, the film's director, standing beside him with 2 glasses. "Just taking a breather," Thomas replied, accepting the offered drink. Robert nodded toward the crowd. "You seemed distracted during the screening." "That obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching you act for 20 years, Robert said with a smile. "Something on your mind?" Thomas considered deflecting, but Robert was one of the few people in the industry he genuinely trusted. "A reporter asked me what love has taught me. Personally, not as a character." Robert nodded. "The dreaded personal question." "What did you say?" "Nothing." I redirected. "As you always do," Robert noted, no judgment in his voice. "Though I admit I'm curious about how you would answer." Thomas looked out at the city lights. "I've never been comfortable sharing that part of myself." "I know," Robert said. "And people respect that about you. You're not selling your personal life for publicity. But sometimes I wonder if staying silent is always the right choice." Thomas admitted quietly. Robert raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like the Thomas Reed I know." "Maybe at some point there are things worth saying," Thomas replied. "Things that might actually matter to someone." Later that night, back in his hotel room, Thomas couldn't sleep. The reporter's question had unlocked something, a restlessness he couldn't quite name. He got up and went to the window, looking out at the city now illuminated by countless lights in the darkness. He thought about the film they had premiered, how its power came from its honesty about human connection. His character had learned that remaining closed off might feel safer, but it prevented the very connections that made life meaningful. Thomas took out his phone and opened the Notes app. For a moment his fingers hovered over the screen, then slowly he began to type, "What love has taught me." He paused, surprised by what he was doing. Then, in the quiet privacy of the night, Thomas Reed, a man who had spent decades keeping his innermost thoughts to himself, began to write down what a lifetime of loving and losing had taught him about the human heart. He didn't know if anyone would ever read these words. He wasn't sure if he wanted them to. But for the first time in years, the silence felt less like protection and more like a barrier to something important, something that perhaps needed to be said. The morning after the premiere, Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains he'd forgotten to close. His phone lay beside him, the Notes app still open with the few lines he'd written before exhaustion had claimed him. Reading them in the clear light of day, he felt a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. What had come over him? With a shake of his head, he closed the app without deleting the notes. A part of him wanted to see where those thoughts might lead, even if no one else ever read them. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews and appearances. Thomas answered questions about the film with practiced ease, deflecting anything too personal with gentle humor. But the young reporter's question lingered in the back of his mind, an echo he couldn't quite shake. "You seem distracted," Diane noted as they rode to his final interview in New York. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," Thomas replied, watching the city pass by outside the car window. Looking forward to going home. Home was a modest house on the outskirts of Portland, far from the spotlight. Thomas had bought it 15 years ago, drawn to the towering trees and the quiet. A place where he could simply be Thomas, not Thomas Reed the actor. One last thing before I forget, Diane said, scrolling through her phone. The Children's Hospital Foundation is holding their annual gala next month. They've invited you as a guest of honor after your visit. Thomas frowned. I didn't visit for recognition. I know that, Diane said patiently. But your presence would mean a lot to them. And the foundation does good work. Thomas sighed. When is it? 3 weeks from Saturday. Black tie, the usual speeches and auction. Oh, and they're giving a Lifetime Achievement Award to Dr. Peterson, the founder. Fine, Thomas agreed reluctantly, but no press if possible. I'll attend, make a donation, and support their work. But I don't want to be featured. Diane nodded, knowing better than to push. I'll make sure they understand. 3 weeks later, Thomas found himself in a tailored tuxedo, standing at the edge of an elegantly decorated ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with white roses and candles. A small orchestra played softly in the corner. Thomas nursed a glass of sparkling water, watching the room. He'd already made his donation, anonymously, as he preferred, and was contemplating how soon he could politely leave when an elderly couple caught his attention. They were seated at a table near the stage, holding hands as they spoke to each other. What struck Thomas wasn't just their obvious affection, but the quality of their attention. In a room full of people networking and posturing, these two were fully present with each other, as if they were alone in the crowd. First time at one of these events? A voice asked. Thomas turned to find a woman in a simple black dress standing beside him. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Chen, Chief of Pediatric Oncology. No, Thomas smiled, but it never gets easier. Dr. Chen laughed. I know what you mean. 15 years working with the foundation and I still hide in corners at these galas. Who's the couple near the stage? Thomas asked. The older gentleman with the silver hair and the woman in the blue dress. That's Dr. Peterson and his wife, Rose, she replied. They're celebrating their 60th anniversary this year, if you can believe it. 60 years, Thomas repeated, watching as the man leaned in to whisper something that made his wife laugh. That's remarkable. What's remarkable is that they still look at each other like that after all this time, Dr. Chen observed. I asked Rose once what their secret was. You know what she said? We never stopped seeing each other. Simple as that. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The orchestra shifted to a slower melody, and Dr. Peterson stood offering his hand to his wife. Despite his slight stoop and her careful movements, there was a grace to them as they moved to the small dance floor. Excuse me, Thomas said to Dr. Chen. I think I need some air. He found his way to a small terrace overlooking a garden. The night was cool, stars visible despite the city lights. Thomas took a deep breath, surprised by how moved he felt watching the couple. Something about their genuine connection had touched a place within him that he usually kept carefully guarded. They reminded him of his parents. His father, a carpenter with rough hands and a gentle heart, had looked at his mother exactly that way, as if she were the most fascinating person in any room. Even after 35 years of marriage, Thomas had never seen that attentiveness fade. When his father passed, his mother had told him something he'd never forgotten. The greatest gift your father ever gave me wasn't flowers or rings or even providing for us. It was that he truly saw me, every day of our life together. Thomas's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the terrace door opening. Dr. Peterson stepped out, seeming surprised to find someone else there. Forgive me, he said. I didn't mean to intrude. Not at all, Thomas assured him. I was just getting some fresh air. Dr. Peterson nodded, coming to stand at the railing. Rose tells me I need to pace myself these days, he said with a wry smile. After 2 dances, I'm supposed to rest. I saw you dancing with your wife, Thomas said. Dr. Chen mentioned you're celebrating 60 years together. Congratulations. Thank you, the older man replied, genuine warmth in his voice. Though I should be the one congratulating you on your work. My grandchildren were quite impressed when I told them I might meet you tonight. Thomas smiled. Your work is far more important than mine. I wouldn't say that, Dr. Peterson replied. Stories matter. They help us make sense of our lives. He glanced back toward the ballroom. Rose and I watched your latest film last month. The scene where your character finally tells his daughter what's in his heart. It reminded me of when I nearly lost Rose to pneumonia 10 years ago. All the things I'd left unsaid suddenly seemed like terrible mistakes. Did you tell her then? Thomas asked quietly. Every day since, Dr. Peterson nodded. Even the difficult truths. Maybe especially those. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Dr. Peterson patted his pocket and pulled out a small worn notebook. Rose bought me this on our first anniversary, he explained. I've carried one like it ever since. A place to write down thoughts I don't want to forget. He smiled. At my age, that becomes increasingly important. The older man looked up at the stars. The funny thing about getting older is realizing how few things actually matter in the end. All the accolades, the achievements, they fade. What remains are the connections, the love we gave and received, the moments we were truly present for another person. Thomas nodded, something resonating deeply within him. I should get back to Rose, Dr. Peterson said. She'll think I've escaped. As the doctor turned to leave, Thomas spoke. Dr. Peterson? May I ask you something? The older man paused. Of course, after 60 years. What has love taught you? Dr. Peterson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. That it's both simpler and harder than most people think. Simpler because it's about showing up, day after day. Harder because showing up means being vulnerable again and again. He adjusted his glasses. But I think you know that already, don't you? Before Thomas could respond, the terrace door opened again and Rose appeared. There you are, Henry, she said, her voice gentle. They're about to begin the awards. Dr. Peterson nodded, then turned back to Thomas. The greatest regrets come not from what we do, but from what we leave unsaid out of fear. Remember that, young man. Later that night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The conversation with Dr. Peterson kept replaying in his mind. He thought about his parents, about relationships that had come and gone in his life, about moments when he'd held back what he truly felt. He picked up his phone and opened the notes he'd started the night of the premiere. For hours, he wrote, not with any purpose or audience in mind, just letting the thoughts flow. About connection and presence, about the courage it takes to be seen, about what his parents had taught him through their example, about mistakes he'd made and lessons he'd learned. When the sky began to lighten outside his window, Thomas finally set the phone down. He felt strangely lighter, as if the act of putting these thoughts into words had released something long held inside. He didn't know what, if anything, he would do with what he'd written. But for the first time in years, the possibility of sharing these parts of himself didn't feel quite so frightening. In the weeks following the gala, Thomas found himself returning to his notes often, adding thoughts and memories as they surfaced. What had started as a few scattered reflections had grown into something more substantial. The writing had become a habit, a way of processing experiences he'd never fully examined before. One rainy afternoon, Thomas sat in his living room, watching droplets race down the windows while soft jazz played in the background. His phone rang, displaying a name he hadn't seen in months. Hello, Kate, he answered, a smile in his voice. Thomas Reed, as I live and breathe, came the reply. I was starting to think you'd become a hermit up there in your forest. Kate had been his first agent 30 years ago, and though she'd retired from the business a decade back, their friendship had endured. Unlike most people in the industry, Kate had never cared about his fame. She'd known him when he was nobody, living on ramen noodles and audition rejections. Not a hermit, Thomas chuckled. Just enjoying the quiet. Well, I'm in Portland for my niece's wedding this weekend. Have time for an old friend? They met the next day at a small cafe tucked away on a side street, the kind of place where no one would recognize him or care if they did. Kate looked exactly as she always had. Silver hair cut in a sharp bob, bright red glasses, and an energy that belied her 70 years. You look good, she said, studying him over her coffee cup. Rested, but there's something different about you. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Different how? I can't quite put my finger on it, she mused. Something in your eyes, like you figured something out. Thomas smiled, not surprised that Kate had noticed a change even he couldn't fully articulate. Maybe I have. Care to share with the class? She prompted. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. Then, to his own surprise, he found himself telling Kate about the young reporter's question, his conversation with Dr. Peterson, and the notes he'd been writing. I've never heard you talk like this, Kate said when he finished. In all the years I've known you, you've guarded your private thoughts like they were state secrets. Maybe I'm getting sentimental in my old age, Thomas joked. Kate shook her head. No, it's more than that. You've always had these thoughts, Thomas. You've just never considered sharing them before. She leaned forward. So what's changed? The question hung between them as Thomas considered his answer. I've been thinking about purpose, he said finally. About what matters. I've spent decades telling other people's stories through my characters. But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I have something of my own to say. He looked down at his coffee. And then I wonder if that's just ego talking. Kate laughed. Thomas Reed worried about his ego? That'll be the day. Her expression softened. Look, you're one of the least egotistical people I know, especially for someone in your position. If you're feeling pulled to share something, it's worth examining why. It feels presumptuous, Thomas admitted. Who am I to offer wisdom about love or connection? Someone who's lived and observed and thought deeply, Kate replied simply. Someone who cares enough to question whether he should speak at all, which already puts you ahead of most people with microphones. They talked for hours, longer than Thomas had spoken to anyone in months. As Kate shared stories about her niece, her garden, and the mystery novel she was writing, Thomas realized how much he'd missed this kind of genuine conversation. The foundation called yesterday, he mentioned as they were preparing to leave. They want me to speak at their fundraiser next month. Are you going to do it? Kate asked. I don't know. I usually decline these things. Kate studied him, her head tilted thoughtfully. Maybe this time you shouldn't. Thomas drove home with Kate's words echoing in his mind. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the rain had stopped and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. He walked to his back porch and sat watching the light change through the trees. His phone buzzed with an email from Diane, checking if he'd made a decision about the foundation speech. His thumb hovered over the screen. What would he even say if he accepted? The thought of standing before a crowd, speaking his own truth rather than lines someone else had written, made his heart race. Yet there was something appealing about the idea, too, a sense of rightness he couldn't explain. Thomas opened his notes app and began to read through everything he'd written since the premiere, about his parents' enduring love, about what Dr. Peterson had shared, about moments of connection that had shaped him and losses that had changed him, about the difference between love as portrayed in films and love as he'd experienced it in real life. Messier, harder, but infinitely more meaningful. There was a coherence to his thoughts that surprised him, threads connecting experiences across decades. Perhaps there was something here worth sharing after all. Before he could reconsider, Thomas replied to Diane's email with a simple, "I'll do it," and set his phone aside. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas had never labored so hard over words that weren't part of a script. He wrote and rewrote, struggling to distill what felt important without sounding preachy or trite. Sometimes he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake in agreeing to speak. 3 days before the event, he still wasn't satisfied with what he'd written. Frustrated, he went for a long walk in the woods surrounding his home, the familiar path soothing his anxiety. Halfway around the lake, he stopped at a fallen log where he often sat to watch the water. A memory surfaced, his father bringing him to a similar spot after his first heartbreak as a teenager. The thing about pain, his father had said, skipping stones across the water, is that it connects us all. Everyone you meet is carrying something. Remembering that is the beginning of compassion. Thomas sat with the memory, feeling a sudden clarity. He'd been approaching this all wrong, trying to craft the perfect speech rather than simply speaking from his heart about what he'd learned through living. When he returned home, he set aside everything he'd written and started fresh, this time without overthinking each word. He wrote as if he were speaking to one person rather than a crowd, sharing thoughts not as universal truths but as his own hard-won understanding. The night of the fundraiser arrived, clear and cool. Thomas stood backstage listening to the foundation director welcome everyone and explain the work they'd accomplished over the past year. His notes were folded in his pocket, though he'd memorized every word. "I don't think I've ever seen you nervous before a crowd," Diane whispered, adjusting his tie slightly. "This is different," Thomas replied. "On set, I'm playing someone else. Tonight, it's just me." "You'll be wonderful," she assured him. "Just be yourself." The director was introducing him now, listing his accomplishments and expressing gratitude for his support of the foundation. Thomas took a deep breath and walked onto the stage as applause filled the room. The lights were bright, the audience a blur of faces. Thomas stood at the podium feeling strangely vulnerable. For a moment, he considered giving the standard celebrity speech, brief, polished, forgettable. Then his eyes found Kate in the audience, her red glasses unmistakable. She gave him a small nod, and beside her, to his surprise, sat Dr. Peterson and Rose. The sight of them grounded him, reminding him of why he'd decided to do this. "Thank you for that kind introduction," Thomas began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm honored to be here tonight supporting the incredible work of this foundation." He paused, looking out at the expectant faces. "I was asked to speak about my involvement with the foundation, but with your permission, I'd like to share something more personal. Something I've been thinking about lately, about connection, about presence, and about what truly matters in this brief time we have together." As Thomas began to speak from his heart rather than his prepared notes, he felt a strange sense of coming home to himself, as if in choosing to share these deeply held thoughts, he was finally stepping fully into his own life. As Thomas began to speak, the prepared notes in his pocket suddenly felt unnecessary. Words came naturally, drawn from memories and reflections he'd carried for years. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice growing stronger, "my father worked with his hands. He built things. Furniture, houses, even a treehouse that nearly got me killed when I was 10. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. But what I remember most wasn't what he built. It was how he listened. When you spoke to him, he set down his tools. He turned to you. He was fully there." Thomas paused, seeing his father clearly in his mind. Calloused hands, sawdust in his hair, eyes that never wandered when you spoke. I didn't recognize then what a rare gift that was, to be completely seen and heard by another person. I've spent decades in an industry where people look but don't always see, where they hear but don't always listen. And I've learned that real connection isn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It's about presence, about showing up fully, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. The room had grown quiet, the usual rustling and whispers of a large gathering fading away. A wise man recently told me that the greatest regrets come not from what we do, but from what we leave unsaid out of fear. Thomas glanced toward Dr. Peterson, who nodded slightly. "I've been thinking about that a lot. About all the things we hold back because we're afraid of being vulnerable, of being rejected, of being misunderstood." Thomas took a sip of water, surprised by how steady his hands were despite the pounding of his heart. "Love, as I've experienced it, isn't like it appears in movies." He smiled self-deprecatingly. "And yes, I recognize the irony of an actor saying this. But real love isn't about perfect timing or dramatic declarations. It's quieter and braver than that. It's showing up at 3 a.m. when someone you care about calls in tears. It's sitting in hospital waiting rooms. It's saying the hard truth when it would be easier to stay silent." He thought of his mother in the months after his father's death, how she'd taught him about the courage it takes to keep loving after loss. "My mother used to say that loving someone means choosing them day after day, even when the feeling fades or when it would be easier to walk away. She told me once, the heart isn't just something you feel with. It's something you do with." I didn't understand what she meant until I was much older. Thomas looked out at the faces watching him. Some were nodding in recognition. Others seemed surprised to hear such personal reflections from someone they knew only from films. I've been fortunate enough to experience deep connection in my life, with family, with friends who became family, with people who saw me beyond whatever role I was playing on screen or off. And what I've learned is that these connections aren't accidental. They require intention, attention, and sometimes tremendous courage. He spoke about listening without planning a response, about showing up authentically rather than presenting a curated version of oneself, about how true intimacy comes not from sharing happiness but from daring to share struggles, fears, and failures. We live in a world that often values appearance over substance, that encourages us to present perfect lives and hide our wounds. But it's in sharing our wounds that we find each other, that we build bridges between our separate islands. Thomas hadn't planned to speak about loss, but found himself sharing how his brother's death as a young man had changed him, how grief had cracked him open and eventually made more room for compassion. Pain can be a doorway to deeper connection if we're brave enough to walk through it together, rather than retreating to safer ground. The people who have meant the most to me aren't those who offered easy comfort, but those who weren't afraid to sit with me in the darkness, who didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. As he continued, Thomas felt something shifting inside him, a wall coming down, a door opening. This wasn't just about sharing thoughts he'd kept private. It was about allowing himself to be seen in a way he'd carefully avoided for decades. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that love requires risk. There's no way around it. To care deeply is to become vulnerable. To connect authentically means opening yourself to possible hurt. For many years, I tried to find a safer way. To care but not too much, to connect but with careful boundaries. He smiled ruefully. It doesn't work. At least it didn't for me. What I found instead was that in trying to protect myself from pain, I was also shutting out joy, growth, and the kind of deep connection that makes life meaningful. As he neared the end of his speech, Thomas looked directly at the audience, making eye contact with individuals rather than speaking to the crowd as a whole. I don't stand here pretending to have mastered any of this. I'm still learning, still making mistakes, still having to remind myself daily to be present, to listen, to risk vulnerability. But I found that each time I choose connection over self-protection, each time I dare to be fully seen rather than hiding behind roles or expectations, something expands inside me. Something heals. He took a breath, feeling both lighter and more grounded than he had in years. So if there's anything I've learned about love that feels worth sharing, it's this. It's not something that just happens to us. It's something we choose, something we practice, something we build together, conversation by conversation, day by day, showing up again and again with our whole selves. Thomas thanked everyone for listening and stepped back from the podium as applause filled the room. But it wasn't the polite, perfunctory applause he was used to at industry events. There was something different in the quality of it, a warmth, an acknowledgement, a response to something genuine. As he made his way off the stage, Thomas noticed something unexpected. People weren't just applauding. Some were wiping away tears. Others were reaching for the hands of those beside them. He'd spoken about connection, and somehow the very act of sharing these thoughts had created a moment of connection in the room. Backstage, Diane was waiting with wide eyes. Thomas, that was... She seemed at a loss for words, which had never happened in all the years he'd known her. That wasn't what I was expecting. Me neither, he admitted with a small smile. I've worked with you for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever heard you speak so personally. Was it too much? Thomas asked, suddenly uncertain. Before Diane could answer, the foundation director appeared, visibly moved. Mr. Reed, that was extraordinary. Would you be willing to meet some of the donors? They're very eager to speak with you. The next hour passed in a blur of handshakes and conversations. What struck Thomas was that no one wanted to talk about his films or career. Instead, people shared their own stories of connection, love, and loss. A woman told him about caring for her husband through Alzheimer's. A young man spoke about reconciling with his father after years of estrangement. People approached him not as a celebrity, but as someone who had articulated something that resonated with their own experiences. When the crowd finally thinned, Thomas found Kate waiting for him near the exit. So, she said, her eyes bright behind her red glasses, still think you had nothing worth saying? Thomas laughed softly. I guess I had a few things. A few things, Kate repeated with a shake of her head. Thomas, do you have any idea what just happened in there? You had an entire ballroom of people, many of whom came just to see a movie star and write a check, completely transfixed. Not because of who you are, but because of what you said. Before Thomas could respond, Dr. Peterson and Rose approached. The older man extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply, for reminding this old doctor that wisdom isn't found only in medical textbooks. Rose's eyes were kind as she added, You gave words to things many people feel but struggle to express. That's a special kind of gift. Later that night, driving home under a sky full of stars, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. For so long he had equated privacy with safety, believing that keeping parts of himself hidden was necessary protection. Yet speaking his truth had left him feeling not exposed, but more authentically himself than he had in years. His phone buzzed with a message from Diane. The foundation says they've received more donations tonight than at any previous event. And they're already getting calls about your speech. I think you started something. Thomas set the phone aside, watching the road unfold before him in the headlights. He didn't know what, if anything, would come from tonight. But something had shifted, both around him and within him, and for now that was enough. Thomas woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. For a moment he lay still, remembering the events of the previous night. The speech, the conversations afterward, the unexpected feeling of lightness that had followed sharing thoughts he'd kept private for so long. His phone, set to silent, was blinking with notifications. Dozens of them. Thomas reached for it with a sense of curiosity, rather than the usual dread such attention brought. Messages from friends who had heard about the speech. Emails from Diane, and most surprising, a link to a video someone had posted online. Despite the Foundation's no recording policy, someone had captured his words on their phone and shared them. Thomas watched a portion of it, strange as it was to see himself speaking not lines from a script, but his own heart's truths. The video had thousands of views, already, in comments that made his throat tight with emotion. I needed to hear this today. This helped me understand something I've been struggling with for years. I just called my brother after 5 years of not speaking. His first instinct was to ask Diane to have the video removed. His usual response to any unauthorized content. But something stopped him. These weren't embarrassing paparazzi photos or out-of-context quotes. This was something he had chosen to share, now reaching people beyond that ballroom. Thomas set his phone aside and made coffee, carrying it out to his back porch. The morning was cool and clear, birds calling to each other in the trees surrounding his home. He had 3 weeks before he needed to be back in Los Angeles to begin work on a new film. 3 weeks of quiet to process whatever had begun last night. But the quiet didn't last. By afternoon, Diane was calling with updates that made it clear something unexpected was happening. Major news outlets had picked up the video. Social media was filled with clips and quotes. People were sharing their own stories of love and connection in response. The Foundation's phone is ringing off the hook, Diane told him. Everyone wants to know if you're going to speak at other events. There's talk of a book. Thomas, I've never seen anything like this reaction, especially not to something so personal. Thomas listened, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't plan for any of this, he said finally. I know, Diane replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. That's exactly why it's resonating. It wasn't calculated or packaged. It was just true. Over the next few days, Thomas received hundreds of messages, from colleagues, from strangers, from people who had been moved by his words. Some shared their own stories of connection and loss. Others thanked him for putting into words feelings they had struggled to express. A week after the speech, Kate arrived at his door unannounced, holding up a bottle of wine. I figured you might need a friend right about now, she said. They sat on his porch as evening fell, the air growing cool around them. Kate listened as Thomas tried to make sense of what was happening. I don't understand it, he admitted. I didn't say anything profound or original. These were just my thoughts, my experiences. That's exactly why it matters, Kate replied, refilling their glasses. People are hungry for authenticity, Thomas. Not polished sound bites or carefully crafted public statements, but real human experience. You opened a door that many people didn't even realize was there. Thomas shook his head. I'm not qualified to be any kind of authority on love or relationships. I've made plenty of mistakes, had my share of failures. Kate laughed. Of course you have. That's what makes what you said believable. You weren't preaching from some mountaintop of perfect wisdom. You were speaking as someone who's lived and learned and is still figuring things out. She looked at him over her glass. That's the only kind of wisdom worth listening to. As days turned into weeks, Thomas was surprised to find himself not retreating from the attention, as would have been his pattern in the past, but engaging with it thoughtfully. He declined the talk show invitations and interview requests, but began responding to some of the messages, particularly from young people who seemed to be struggling with connection in a world increasingly mediated by screens and careful self-presentation. On a rainy Tuesday, he received an email from Laura, the young reporter who had asked the question that started everything. She had seen the video of his speech and wrote to thank him for answering her question, even if it had come months later. Thomas smiled as he read her words. I ask that question to everyone I interview. Not because it's what my editors want, but because I believe that's where the real story always is, in what people have learned about love. Most celebrities give me practiced answers or deflect. You deflected too that night on the red carpet, but then you went away and really thought about it. You didn't have to do that. Thank you for taking the question seriously, he wrote back, thanking her for asking a question that had changed something in him. 2 days before Thomas was scheduled to return to Los Angeles, Dr. Peterson called with an invitation. A small community center where he volunteered was hosting an intergenerational dialogue about connection in the digital age. Would Thomas consider participating not as a celebrity, but as someone with experiences to share? To his own surprise, Thomas agreed. The community center was nothing like the elegant ballroom of the Foundation Gala. Folding chairs and simple refreshments. About 50 people ranging from teenagers to elderly residents from a nearby retirement community. No press, no cameras, just people who had come to listen and share. Thomas sat in a circle with Dr. Peterson and several others, each speaking in turn about their experiences of connection across different stages of life. An 18-year-old talked about finding meaningful friendships online, while struggling to connect with peers at school. A grandfather spoke about learning to text so he could stay in touch with his grandchildren. A young mother described the isolation she felt after having her first child, and how a neighborhood support group had saved her. When it was his turn, Thomas spoke simply about his own journey from guarding his private self to discovering the freedom that came with authentic expression. For most of my life, he said, I believed that safety meant keeping parts of myself hidden. What I'm learning now is that there's a different kind of safety that comes from being known, truly known by others. After the formal dialogue ended, people lingered, continuing conversations in smaller groups. Thomas found himself speaking with a high school teacher, who had brought several of her students. They don't believe me when I tell them that real connection requires putting phones down and being fully present, she said with a sigh. Maybe they'll listen to you, Thomas smiled. I'm not sure they should. I'm still figuring it out myself. He glanced at the students who were ironically looking at their phones. But maybe that's the point. We're all learning together across generations how to stay human in a changing world. On his last morning in Portland, Thomas woke early and took a final walk through the woods before his flight. The path was familiar, but he noticed details he'd overlooked before. New growth on the forest floor, subtle variations in birdsong, the particular quality of light filtering through leaves. His phone buzzed with a message from his agent about the upcoming film project, pulling him back to the world that had been his life for so long. But Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted. The boundaries between his public and private selves had become more permeable, not in a way that left him exposed or vulnerable, but in a way that felt more integrated, more whole. As he packed his bags later that morning, Thomas found the Notes app still open on his phone. On impulse, he began a new entry. What I'm still learning about love. He wrote as he waited for his car to the airport, not knowing if these words would remain private reflections or someday be shared. But the question no longer filled him with anxiety. Either way, the act of articulating his thoughts had become valuable in itself, a way of paying attention, of making meaning, of connecting to his own experience. On the flight to Los Angeles, Thomas gazed out the window at clouds stretching to the horizon. He thought about the unexpected journey that had begun with a single question on a red carpet, about how breaking his silence had created ripples he could never have anticipated, about how in sharing what he'd learned about love, he had opened himself to new experiences of connection. The future would bring what it would bring. But whatever came next, Thomas knew he would approach it differently, more present, more open, more willing to be seen. Not just as Thomas Reed the actor, but as himself, still learning, still growing, still discovering what it means to love and be loved in this complex, beautiful world.